You called. Nobody answered. Not because they were busy, not because they missed it, because the version of you they were attached to, the one with the job, the money, the status, the usefulness, that version was gone. And without it, you'd stopped making sense to them. You'd become a problem they didn't know how to price. This is the thing nobody prepares you for when everything falls apart. Not the financial hit, not the professional embarrassment, the silence, the specific surgical silence of people you thought you knew, people you'd sat across from at dinner tables and laughed with and called when things were good, now calculating, in real time, whether you were still worth the cost. And here's the part that stays with you long after the money comes back, or the situation stabilizes. They revealed themselves. Not slowly. Completely. In the space of a few weeks, sometimes a few days, you saw something you could never unsee. And we're going to spend this video understanding exactly what you saw, what it means psychologically, why it happened, and what you're supposed to do with that knowledge now. Before we get there, you need to understand one thing clearly. The people who disappeared, they weren't pretending all along. That's the version of the story that's easy to believe and completely wrong. They weren't performing a friendship while secretly waiting to abandon you. Something far more disturbing was happening, and the psychology behind it is older than any of us. Let's start with the architecture of every relationship you've ever had. In 1958, sociologist George Homans published a framework that has quietly explained human behavior ever since. He called it social exchange theory. The core idea is uncomfortable in its simplicity. People pursue and maintain relationships where the rewards outweigh the costs, and they withdraw from relationships where they don't. Not all people. Not consciously. But the pattern holds with a consistency that makes it one of the most replicated findings in social psychology. Rewards in a relationship aren't just emotional. They're status, access, entertainment, the feeling of being associated with someone whose life reflects well on your own, the practical usefulness of knowing someone who can open a door, make a call, provide a reference, the reflected confidence of being seen with someone who carries themselves well. These things aren't shallow in the way we sometimes want them to be. They're built into the social architecture of how human groups have always functioned. In every society that has ever existed, association with the powerful protected you. Association with the fallen endangered you. Your brain knows this. So does theirs. But here's what nobody tells you about social exchange theory, and this is the part that changes how you read your own history. Most relationships contain two completely different layers operating simultaneously. The surface layer, the one both people see and discuss and celebrate, looks like genuine connection. Shared memories, mutual warmth, the feeling of being known. And that layer is real. The warmth was real. The laughter was real. The affection in the moment was completely genuine. None of it was fabricated. But underneath it, in most relationships, not all but most, there runs a silent calculation that neither person ever articulates, because articulating it would make it impossible to sustain. The relationship continues as long as the exchange remains favorable. The moment it doesn't, the warmth doesn't disappear because it was fake. It disappears because it was conditional, and conditions changed. Think about that for a second. The friendship wasn't a lie. It was a contract. And you never saw the terms because they were written in invisible ink. This is what Seneca, the Roman Stoic philosopher writing roughly 2,000 years ago, identified with a precision that modern psychology has spent decades trying to match. He wrote, "In prosperity it is very easy to find a friend, but in adversity it is the most difficult of all things." He wasn't being cynical. He was being clinical. He'd watched enough careers collapse, enough fortunes dissolve, enough powerful men fall from grace to understand something that comfort conceals. Most relationships are organized around what you represent, not who you are. And when what you represent changes, the relationship changes with it. Automatically, without malice. as naturally as a plant turns away from a light source that has moved. But here's the open loop you need to hold while we keep going, because we'll come back to this near the end of the video, and it's the most important reframe in everything we're covering today. The people who disappeared, their departure tells you almost nothing about your worth. It tells you everything about their capacity. Now let's talk about the specific categories. Because not everyone who retreats when you have nothing retreats in the same way or for the same reason. And understanding the difference matters, not for the sake of blame, but for the sake of accuracy. You need to see clearly what happened if you're going to use it. The first category is the largest. Call them the utility bonded. These people genuinely liked you. The warmth was real, but the relationship was built, from the beginning, on what you provided, not financially necessarily, but functionally. Access to a network, the pleasure of your company at its most resourced and confident, the social lift of being in your orbit when your orbit had gravity. They didn't think of themselves as transactional. Nobody does. But the relationship existed inside a set of conditions, and when those conditions changed, the relationship had nothing left to run on. They didn't leave because they hated you. They left because the cost of staying, the social inconvenience, the emotional demand, the absence of the old rewards, exceeded what they were willing to carry. Research in social psychology describes this pattern as cost-benefit recalibration. The relationship enters what Thibaut and Kelley, in their foundational 1959 work, The Social Psychology of Groups, called the comparison level for alternatives. People don't just evaluate a relationship in isolation, they compare it to their other options. When you had status and resources, staying close to you was the best available option. When you lost them, better options suddenly appeared elsewhere. The math changed. They followed the math. They probably told themselves a story about it. Too busy, not my problem, you need space. But the story came after the calculation, not before. The second category is smaller, but more disorienting. The status adjacent. These are the people who weren't close to you for what you gave them. They were close to you for what being close to you said about them. Your success was their validation. Your confidence reflected on theirs. Your network implied something about who they were. When your situation changed, it wasn't just the practical benefits that dissolved. The mirror broke, and a broken mirror is useless. Worse than useless, it shows you something you don't want to see. So they moved toward other mirrors, shinier ones that still gave back a flattering image. You felt this before. The person who was most enthusiastic about your success, who became strangely cold the moment things got difficult. It felt like betrayal. It was more specific than that. They'd been using your ascent as evidence for their own. Your fall undermined that story. So they rewrote you out of it. Here's where the dark psychology deepens. Both of these categories, the utility bonded and the status adjacent, share something that makes the abandonment more destabilizing than it should logically be. They were convincing. The relationship felt real because large parts of it were real. You weren't wrong to trust them. You weren't naive. The connection existed. It just existed inside conditions neither of you ever explicitly named. And when the conditions ended, the connection ended with them. Cleanly, without announcement, without the conversation you deserved. That's what makes it feel like a revelation rather than just a loss. You weren't just abandoned, you were corrected. Your understanding of who those people were, an understanding built on years of evidence, turned out to be incomplete. And incomplete understanding of people you trusted is one of the most specific kinds of pain that exists. Now. The third category, the smallest, the most important, the ones who stayed. Not because they didn't notice the change, not because they were unaware of the calculation, but because, for them, the calculation had a different structure. Their investment in you wasn't built on what you represented. It was built on who you were when the representation was stripped away. And when it was stripped away, they found out, perhaps for the first time, that the person underneath the status was someone they actually wanted to know. Seneca wrote something in his letters that cuts directly to this. He said, "He who regards himself only and enters upon friendships for this reason reckons wrongly. The end will be like the beginning. At the first rattle of the chain, such a friend will desert you. The ones who stayed when the chain rattled, they entered the friendship for a different reason. And that reason doesn't disappear when circumstances change. You probably know exactly who these people are. You can list them right now, maybe 3, maybe fewer, maybe 1. But you know who stayed in the room when the room became a difficult place to be. And the knowledge of who stayed is the most accurate data about human character you will ever receive. You couldn't have learned it any other way. The comfort of your prosperous days would have kept it hidden indefinitely. Here's the deepest psychological truth underneath all of this. Adversity doesn't change people, it reveals them. The person who disappeared when you had nothing didn't become someone different under pressure. They showed you who they'd always been, someone whose relationship with you was built on conditions rather than character. The conditions just hadn't changed before, so you'd never had the test. The test ran. You got the results. Painful, clear, permanent results. And the cruelest part, the thing the psychology literature rarely states plainly, is that people who abandon you in hardship often feel entirely justified in doing so. The social exchange calculation is so deeply embedded in normal human behavior that departing from a disadvantageous relationship doesn't feel like betrayal from the inside. It feels like common sense. It feels like self-preservation. The person who stopped returning your calls in your worst year probably doesn't think of themselves as someone who abandoned a friend in need. They think of themselves as someone who wisely redirected their energy. They've already constructed the narrative that makes their behavior reasonable, and that narrative is so convincing that confronting them with it would produce genuine confusion. They don't feel guilty because the system they were operating inside told them they were doing nothing wrong. This is the specific way that social conditioning protects transactional behavior, by making it feel like natural self-interest rather than moral failure. And that's important for you to understand, not to excuse what happened, but to stop making it about your inadequacy. The people who left didn't leave because there was something wrong with you. They left because there was something limited in them. A limited capacity for relationships that run on character rather than conditions. Seneca described this limitation precisely. He wrote, "Fire is the test of gold, adversity of strong men." He wasn't speaking of strength as toughness, he was speaking of composition. Gold doesn't become gold in the fire. The fire reveals that it already was. Cheap metal looks like gold until the temperature rises. Then the truth surfaces. The people who stayed when you had nothing aren't more virtuous than the ones who left. They're differently composed, and the fire showed you the composition. Now here's what you do with it. The instinctive response to this kind of revelation is one of 2 things. The first is bitterness, a generalized suspicion of everyone, a withdrawal from new relationships, a protective cynicism that keeps you safe from future disappointment by keeping everyone at arm's length. This response is understandable. It's also expensive. It trades the pain of past abandonment for the permanent poverty of present isolation. The people who left took enough from you. Don't let them take your capacity for connection too. The second instinctive response is equally problematic: pretending it didn't happen. Allowing the people who disappeared to re-enter your life when circumstances improve, treating the abandonment as a temporary glitch, reconstructing the original story as though the test never ran. This is generous in the wrong direction. It doesn't serve connection, it serves comfort, yours and theirs, and it leaves you vulnerable to the same calculation the next time conditions change. The response that actually serves you is harder than either of these. It requires you to hold 2 things simultaneously. First, the accurate information about who these people are. The test ran. The results are in. That data is yours, and you don't have to pretend otherwise. Second, the understanding that their limitation is their problem, not your wound. You don't have to carry resentment about it. You simply have to update your understanding and act accordingly. Seneca's framework for this was specific. He distinguished between people who love you for what you are, communal relationships, in modern psychological language, and people who love you for what you provide, transactional ones. His prescription wasn't to eliminate the second category from your life. It was to know which category each person occupied, to stop expecting communal behavior from transactional connections, to stop being devastated when a contract ended, when you'd mistaken a contract for a covenant. Here's the satisfaction. You now know. You couldn't have known before. Not this clearly, not with this certainty. The people who stayed when you had nothing gave you something you can't buy and can't manufacture and can't research your way into. They gave you proof, documented, tested, undeniable proof that their investment in you was built on something that conditions can't touch. That is worth more than any version of your prosperous days when you didn't yet know who was really in the room with you. You called. Nobody answered. And in that silence, you received the clearest picture of your actual social world that you had ever been given. Some of it was painful. Some of it was confirming. Some of it was the beginning of a smaller, quieter, more accurately understood life, one built on fewer connections that are real rather than many connections that are conditional. That's not a consolation prize. That's the upgrade.